Thank you very much, Bishop Bartlett. Uh, it's good to see all of you here on Saturday morning when many people would just stay home and rest and be with their family. The fact that you are willing to come out here and discuss this very troubling, contentious issue, I think is a wonderful thing. For those of you who have been following in any way the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you must realize that we are now at a major turning point. There is now a common recognition that the perimeters, the framework, the paradigm of a two-state solution has pretty much collapsed and become no longer applicable. Now, I don't say this lightly, because for many years, for several decades in fact, almost everybody who has been involved in any positive, constructive way, who cared about peace and justice, who cared about both sides rather than totally one side, pretty much thought that the two-state solution was a realistic, pragmatic, effective way to deal with it. May not be perfect, may not be a very principled position, but it allowed both sides to maintain pretty much their ideological, national positions without totally negating the others. You just geographically limited your claims or your goals to one portion of the disputed country, and it reflected more or less the balance of power at the time in 1967 between the State of Israel and the Palestinian people and the Arab world for that matter. So it made sense. It was a pragmatic solution. And initially it was, of course, opposed by a lot of people in both communities, but eventually it became the accepted norm. The biggest problem for the two-state solution was, of course, that Israel, all Israeli governments, right or left, while continuing to speak the language of two states, were very busy undermining its very essence. Because a two-state solution presumes that there's going to be a Palestinian state in the occupied territories. So when you start moving civilians into these places, and you start building settlements, and you start settling people in a permanent way, not just temporary military necessity, but, homes and kindergartens and wash lines and swimming pools and graveyards and the entire structure of community, you're basically saying we're not leaving. This is all ours. And this has continued, not just the physical moving of population and the building of settlements, but the creation of such an extensive infrastructure of roads that connect these settlements together and connect them to Israel, of laws and regulations that applied to settlers that did not apply to the Arab population. And by the way, those settlements were Jewish settlements. They were not Israeli settlements. Israeli Arabs, who are 20% of the population, cannot come and live in those settlements. But Jews from anywhere in the world can and do. A separate court system, a separate police system, a separate health system, a separate national insurance system, separate educational, separate and utterly unequal system. And this system became so extensive and pervasive and such an integral part of the state of Israel and what it was and who it was, that finally, the realization has set in that this is, in fact, irreversible. That even if the Israeli government were to choose to uproot those settlements, to make way for the two-state solution, it could not do so. Never mind that nobody in Israel really is talking about uprooting those settlements. Now, as this realization set in, and recently Secretary of State John Kerry made it very clear that that's the case now, and people have stopped talking even in the State Department about a two-state solution. The question comes to mind, if that is not the solution, then what is? If we abandon that vision, that dream, that grand compromise, then what are we left with? I have to tell you that very few people are really considering that question. And if anything, I hope today with the respondents who will be responding in the questions and answers, I hope that you will begin to seriously think about that question. And it's not going to be an easy process. It's a very painful process, because it requires not only you, but it requires both Palestinians and Israelis to radically rethink their ideologies and their plans and their schemes in light of a new reality. I'll start with the Palestinians. Our narrative is that Palestine Arabiya, Palestine is an Arab country. It's an integral part of the Arab world. That these outside settlers who came in from all over the world really are foreigners. And somehow they need to go back where they came from, or somehow we need to liberate Palestine from this Zionist influence that has replaced and displaced us, and we need to have our own country back. Now we need to come to terms with the fact that those outsiders, those foreigners, those settlers are here to stay, and that they consider this as their own. And that if we are going to have a future country together with them, Palestine is going to be both Arab and Jewish. What does that mean for Palestinian nationalism? What does that mean for our position in the Arab world? Who really are we? Can we be in the same country as all those foreigners and still consider them compatriots, fellow citizens? Can the country be both ours and theirs at the same time? It's a serious question that we haven't had to think about for a long time, because we were still expecting a Palestinian state and part of Palestine, which now it's very clear is not going to happen. For Israelis, for Zionists, for those who wanted the state of Israel, again, their initial ideology was that this is ours, whether because God gave it to us, or for historic reasons, or because we need it for our very survival after having faced millennia of anti-Semitism and the recent genocide. We need this place. It is ours. The fact that there are other people living there is almost not on our screen. Either they have to be spirited away to other countries or pushed out or subjugated or somehow marginalized, because Israel is a Jewish state and needs to be a Jewish state. And to the extent that they leave, whether forcibly or on their own, they simply must be kept outside. To the extent that some of them stayed, they must be kept under military rule or somehow maybe given certain rights as individuals, but certainly not as a group. And certainly not in large numbers. We need to control demography. Every additional non-Jewish child that is born becomes a threat to the very state. And if we are fortunate enough to have all of the land, which is what happened after 67, then we must keep those other portions of it somehow separate from the Jewish state. We must take as much land as we can, but as few people as we can. And we must keep them fragmented. The outside, those who are outside are refugees. They're not our problem anymore. They're somebody else's problem. Those who are inside need to be manipulated and kept under control. Now, wait a minute. Once you realize that that can no longer happen, that the idea of a two-state, that they're there and we're here and we have a certain separate relationship, once they are all here, under our control, under our authority, what does that mean for us? What kind of country do we have? What does it mean to have a Jewish state? And how does a Jewish state relate to its non-Jewish citizens or subjects? At the time, in 1948, nobody questioned the need for a Jewish homeland, which quickly moved into a Jewish state. What does that mean? How can you have a Jewish state without necessarily discriminating against non-Jews, especially if they are already there and they think of it as their home? Now, these questions, what is a Jewish state? What is Zionism? What kind of state do we have? All these questions have been deferred because we are in negotiations. We're trying to create two states, one for us and one for them. And we can even build a wall and we're here and they're there. But what happens if there's 600,000 of us Jews living on the other side of the supposed separation wall? What does separation mean? Hafradah in Hebrew. Apartheid, in other words. Do we want a state where there are two levels of citizenship or two levels of rights? There's Jews and non-Jews with separate and unequal rights for both. Do we really want that? Is this what it is all about? And if not, then what do we have? What do we have? What do we want? A Canadian friend of ours, Harold Jewick, who used to be the Mennonite Central Committee's director for about 30 years ago, tells me he now tells all his Israeli friends and their supporters, guys, you know what? You won. There's not going to be a Palestinian state. It's not going to happen. Now what? Now what? What are you going to do? Is there a formula that people like yourselves, also the outsiders, who care about Israelis and who care about Palestinians, Is there a vision that you can adopt? You know, for a long time, the whole idea of a secular democratic state was taboo. Because you talk about that and you're basically negating the Jewish state, which in the minds of many people was the equivalent of calling for a second Holocaust. And therefore nobody would talk about a one-state solution. That was forbidden, not allowed. And one of the reasons why it was not allowed is because people misunderstand democracy. They think one person, one vote means whoever has 51% can totally crush, dominate, negate, and avoid and ignore the others. They can't do that. Abadi in Iraq thought that after the US invasion, they like us to have elections, good. We Shiites definitely have more than 51% in Iraq. We'll have elections, we'll win, and they did. And then we can forget about the Sunnis. Can't forget about the Sunnis in Iraq. They have been the dominant group for centuries. And now you're saying you are nobody? Well, you end up with Daesh. You end up with Sunnis going berserk. Mursi in Egypt thought that we have elections, I win, I get the majority of votes because the opposition is disunited, and I'll turn this into an Islamic state. The Muslim Brotherhoods take over, thank you very much everybody else, democracy rules. Then he gets pushed away by the army and they say, no. We are the majority, we will ignore, in fact, abolish, in fact, criminalize the Muslim Brotherhood, who represent 25-30% of the population. You cannot do that. You cannot, in a large multi-ethnic or multi-religious society, totally ignore substantial minorities without asking for trouble. You're either asking for civil war, secession, or permanent problems. Even in this country, where African Americans, only 15-20% of the population, were even slaves, the political system cannot tolerate, cannot deal with totally disenfranchising them. You cannot do that. Or women, or Latinos, or Catholics. You must find a formula where substantial minorities have a stake and participate and can be equal without being the majority. Otherwise, you're always counting numbers and counting babies and trying to speak in very racist terms of all other groups. So, a new conversation is necessary. We need to begin to think in new terms about Israel and Palestine. It's not going to be easy because we are all caught up in that paradigm. Again, I'll start with ourselves. One major constituency, about 600,000 of them, are the settlers. We have demonized them. We have considered them totally outside of the pale. Partly because, obviously, in a two-state scenario, they are the problem. Well, if the two-state solution doesn't work, maybe we need to bring them into the conversation. I was amazed to find that just as in Israel, so in the settlements, there are some nice people, some decent people, some people who care about human rights, some people who believe in equality between Jews and Arabs. I met a settler who even believed in the Palestinian right of return For him it was self-evident. If we can come back after 2,000 years, why can't they come back after 2 generations? We simply must find a way to deal with those people as well. And Gaza and Hamas, can you imagine any kind of peace scenario that doesn't involve Hamas? It's like the old days when they were trying to solve the Palestinian problem without dealing with the PLO. It has now been criminalized, just like it was, to even have any contacts with Hamas. Now, I'm not a Hamas member, obviously. I'm a Christian to begin with. But they need to be brought into the political process. They need to be met with, they need to be talked to, they need to be engaged and brought into the equation. You cannot have people in Hamas be outside of the conversation. You cannot tolerate a situation like the one that exists in Gaza today. Close to 2 million people crammed into tight quarters where their borders are utterly and totally and completely controlled at gunpoint. Nobody can come in, nobody can come out. They can't get access to electricity, water. 90% of their water is terrible, is undrinkable. If a Gaza family wants to spend its money on bottled clean water, it has to spend about 1/3 of its income on water alone. How can we tolerate something like the siege of Gaza all these years with no response, no involvement? We're so caught up with this issue of the West Bank and the settlements, and we're always talking about it because we're caught up in the 2-state scenario. We're totally ignoring Gaza and Hamas. I admit this is not an easy conversation, but we need to start having it. And we need to start having new thinking. And we need to start being open to new possibilities. The fact is, there are major changes taking place on the ground as well. Precisely at a time when, as I mentioned, you have the new wall, you have the new restrictions, you have the new fragmented regime of areas A, B, and C, which I'm sure you're familiar with. There is also a huge shift towards the right wing in Israel. Every new government is much more right wing and radical than the previous one. The attempts to portray Israel as a democracy, as an open and liberal society is now wearing very thin. New laws are being proposed every day that are blatantly racist and discriminatory on their face, reducing the area of free speech and open discussion. Laws that would not be even contemplated 5 or 10 years ago are now being proposed. Parties that were considered, even in Israel, totally illegal and off the charts, are now members of the government. People think, well, maybe if Netanyahu gets voted out, I can assure you, if Netanyahu loses power, whoever replaces him is going to be more right-wing than he is. The new generation, which usually is a source of hope, new Israeli generations are more right-wing than their parents. As a result, there's a new phenomena which you may have experienced in this country, where pro-Israeli and pro-Zionist forces, feeling that they can't anymore count on public support, have stopped caring about public support and instead are exercising their power and influence at the very top, using really power and pressure rather than reason and persuasion and sympathy to get everything that they want. Even in Congress, there are no more letter-writing campaigns to Congress people. Instead, there's somebody, some intern in a congressman's office who will get a phone call how he needs to vote or she needs to vote or what is of value to them. Recently, I was on a speaking tour in Canada, and I was told that I was going to speak at a law school, that instead of having people come to my lecture and challenge me from the audience, which hasn't happened in about 10 years for me, instead they will call the dean of the law school, "Why are you inviting Jonathan Kuttab? You shouldn't be inviting him, or maybe you should be inviting a representative of the Israeli government to balance what you hear." This jumping over the top. People who are student activists realize that when they have a strong chapter for BDS or social justice for Palestine and they win a student vote, the president of the college will be contacted and the board of trustees will act to try and make that no longer possible. They are even having state legislatures and governors pass new anti-BDS legislation, clearly unconstitutional, to prevent what is basically a non-violent form of protest and pressure against Israel or Israeli settlements or Israeli goods. So we now are moving into a new period where power politics is now moving to pressure from the very top. And ordinary activists, students, churches, unions, are now having a whole different fight on their hands if they want to struggle for peace and justice. I say all these things not to discourage us. I always hold that there is a whole difference between optimism and hope. I may not be terribly optimistic, certainly in the short run, about expecting things to improve very soon. But I am full of hope, because I know that the arc of history, however long, bends towards justice, as Martin Luther King Jr. used to say. That the struggle for peace, justice, reconciliation, and a better future is ultimately going to win. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be painless. It's going to be difficult, and it's going to require a lot, especially by, as I said, people who care for both sides. But that conversation needs to start, and needs to start soon. Thank you very much.